Opnieuw verdwijnt in deze laatste opmerking van Foucault het individuele leven van de geleerde onderzoeker uit het beeld. Maar hoe zit het dan met de verhouding van de mens tot zijn cultuur als het gaat over de politiek en misschien zelfs over de vraag hoe je die cultuur en die maatschappij kunt veranderen? Immers, men kan wel laten zien dat in de geschiedenis van de wetenschap en in de geschiedenis van de cultuur de inbreng van het individu een vrijwel te verwaarlozen rol speelt. De vraag, hoe moet ik handelen, de politieke vraag, blijft desalniettemin recht overeind staan. En het zal na het voorgaande misschien al duidelijk zijn dat die politieke vraag in het perspectief van Foucault heel sterk wordt tot de vraag: in hoeverre kan de mens ontsnappen aan zijn eigen cultuur? Daarbij is het wel van belang om op te merken dat Foucault zich helemaal niet wil distancieren van de politiek. Integendeel, hij zegt ergens: wat zou ik ideologisch verblind moeten zijn om me niet te interesseren voor datgene wat het meest wezenlijke is in het menselijk bestaan. Economische verhoudingen, machtsverhoudingen en noem maar op. Chomsky en Foucault zijn het dus wel eens over het belang van de politieke vraagstelling. Het is misschien ook wel informatief om nog eventjes uitdrukkelijk te zeggen dat Chomsky zijn politieke standpunt betitelt als anarcho-syndicalisme. Hij is van mening dat het noodzakelijk is de verschillende vormen van kapitalisme op te heffen en te doorbreken ten bate van de directe participatie van de arbeider in arbeidersraden enzovoort. Decentralisatie, socialisatie en participatie, het zijn sleutelwoorden in het politiek programma van Chomsky. Chomsky zegt weliswaar dat hij geen noodzakelijk verband ziet tussen zijn wetenschappelijke inzichten en zijn politieke, maar uit de nu volgende openingszet blijkt dat hij regelrecht vanuit zijn wetenschappelijke opvattingen afstevend op de politiek. Zijn politieke en wetenschappelijke inzichten mogen niet logisch uit elkaar voortvloeien, ze lopen wel degelijk parallel.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then of course it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Je suis dans ma démarche beaucoup moins avancée, je vais beaucoup moins loin que M. Chomsky, c'est-à-dire que j'avoue n'être pas capable de définir, ni à plus forte raison de proposer un modèle de fonctionnement social idéal pour notre société scientifique ou technologique. En revanche, une des tâches qui me paraît urgente, immédiate, avant même toute autre chose, c'est celle-ci. On a l'habitude, du moins dans notre société européenne, de considérer que le pouvoir, il est localisé entre les mains du gouvernement et il s'exerce par un certain nombre d'institutions bien particulières qui sont l'administration, en France on appelle ça préfectorale, enfin je ne sais pas comment on dit ailleurs, l'administration, la police, l'armée. On sait que toutes ces institutions-là sont faites pour transmettre les ordres, les faire appliquer et punir les gens qui n'obéissent pas. Mais je crois que le pouvoir politique, il s'exerce encore, il s'exerce en outre, de plus, par l'intermédiaire d'un certain nombre d'institutions qui ont l'air, comme ça, de n'avoir rien de commun avec le pouvoir politique, qui ont l'air d'en être indépendantes et qui ne le sont pas. On sait bien que l'université, d'une façon générale, tout le système scolaire, qui en apparence est fait simplement pour distribuer le savoir, on sait que cet appareil scolaire est fait pour maintenir au pouvoir une certaine classe sociale et exclure des instruments du pouvoir toute une autre classe sociale. Quelque chose comme la psychiatrie, qui en apparence aussi n'est destinée qu'au bien de l'humanité et à la connaissance des psychiatres, la psychiatrie est encore une certaine manière de faire peser un pouvoir politique sur un groupe social. La justice également. Bon, et il me semble que la tâche politique actuelle dans une société comme la nôtre, c'est de critiquer le jeu des institutions apparemment les plus neutres et les plus indépendantes, de les critiquer, de l'attaquer de telle manière que la violence politique qui s'exerçait obscurément en eux surgisse et pour qu'on puisse lutter contre elle. À vouloir tout de suite, enfin si on cherche tout de suite à donner le profil et la formule de la société future, sans avoir bien fait la critique de tous les rapports de violence politique qui s'exercent dans notre société, on risque de les laisser se reconstituer, même à travers des formes aussi nobles, apparemment aussi pures que celles du syndicalisme anarchiste.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, not only in theory but also in action. That is, there are two intellectual tasks. One, and the one which I was discussing, to try to create the vision of a future just society. Another task is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression and terror and destruction in our own society. And that certainly includes the institutions you mentioned, as well as the central institutions of any industrial society, namely the economic, commercial, and financial institutions, in particular, in the coming period, the great multinational corporations, which are not very far from us physically tonight. Those are the basic institutions of oppression and coercion and autocratic rule that appear to be neutral. After all, they say, well, we're subject to the democracy of the marketplace. Still, I think it would be a great shame to lose or to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical, if you like, task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics, and relates that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized, in which meaningful human life could take place. And in fact, if we are thinking of social transformation or social revolution, though it would be absurd, of course, to try to draw out in detail the point that we're hoping to reach, still we should know something about where we think we're going. And such a theory may tell it to us.
Oui, mais alors là, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un danger? Si on dit qu'il existe une certaine nature humaine, que cette nature humaine n'a pas reçu dans la société actuelle les droits et les possibilités qui lui permettraient de se réaliser. C'est bien ce que vous avez dit, je crois. Et si on admet cela, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de définir cette nature humaine à la fois idéale et réelle, cette nature humaine cachée et réprimée jusqu'à présent, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de la définir dans des termes que nous empruntons à notre société, à notre civilisation, à notre culture? Je vais prendre un exemple qui est un peu caricatural, mais le marxisme d'une certaine époque, à la fin du XIXe, au début du XXe siècle, le marxisme admettait en effet que dans la société capitaliste, l'homme ne recevait pas toute ses possibilités de développement et de réalisation, que la nature humaine était effectivement aliénée dans le système capitaliste. Et le marxisme rêvait d'une nature humaine enfin libérée. Or, cette nature humaine, quel modèle utilisait-il le marxisme de cette époque-là, du XIXe, du début du XXe siècle, quel modèle utilisait-il pour la concevoir, pour la rêver? C'était en réalité le modèle bourgeois. Le marxisme a considéré qu'une société heureuse, c'était une société qui faisait place, par exemple, à une sexualité de type bourgeois, à une famille de type bourgeois, à une esthétique de type bourgeois. Et c'est d'ailleurs tellement vrai que c'est comme ça que ça s'est passé en Union soviétique, où sous prétexte de réaliser une société où l'homme réaliserait enfin sa nature, on a reconstitué une espèce de société à la fois réelle et utopique qui est transposée de la société bourgeoise du XIXe siècle. De sorte que, est-ce que la notion de nature humaine, vous-même, en commençant, vous reconnaissiez, je crois qu'on ne savait pas très bien ce que c'était que cette nature humaine. Alors, est-ce qu'il ne risque pas de nous induire en erreur? Vous savez que Mao Tse-tung parlait de nature humaine bourgeoise et de nature humaine prolétarienne, et il considère que ce n'est pas la même chose.
Well, you see, I think that in the intellectual domain of political action, that is, the domain of trying to construct a vision of a just and free society on the basis of some notion of human nature, in that domain we face the very same problem that we face in immediate political action. For example, to be quite concrete, a lot of my own activity really has to do with the Vietnam War, and a good deal of my own energy goes into civil disobedience. Well, civil disobedience in the United States is an action undertaken in the face of of considerable uncertainties about its effects. For example, it threatens the social order in ways which, let's say, one might argue, bring on fascism. That would be very bad for America, for Vietnam, for Holland, and for everyone else. So there's a danger, that is one danger in undertaking this concrete act. On the other hand, there's a great danger in not undertaking it. Namely, if you don't undertake it, the society of Indochina will be torn to shreds by American power. And in the face of those uncertainties, one has to choose a course of action. Well, similarly, in the intellectual domain, one is faced with the uncertainties that you correctly pose. Our concept of human nature is certainly limited, partial, socially conditioned, constrained by our own character defects and the limitations of the intellectual culture in which we exist. Yet at the same time, it's of critical importance that we have some direction, that we know what impossible goals we're trying to achieve if we hope to achieve some of the possible goals. And that means that we have to be bold enough to speculate and create social theories on the basis of partial knowledge while remaining very open to the strong possibility, in fact overwhelming probability, that at least in some respects we're very far off the mark.
Well, perhaps it is interesting to go on a little bit further on this problem of strategy. So, for example, in the case of Holland, we had something like a population census. You were obliged to fill in your papers and so on, you know. So this you would call, if you are not filling in your papers, civil disobedience.
Right. Now, I would be a little careful about that because going back to some very important point that Monsieur Foucault made, one does not necessarily allow the state to define what is legal. Now, the state has the power to enforce a certain concept of what is legal, but power doesn't imply justice or correctness even. So the state may define something as civil disobedience and may be wrong in doing so. For example, in the United States, the state defines it as civil disobedience to, let's say, derail an ammunition train that's going to Vietnam. And the state is wrong in defining that as civil disobedience because it's legal and proper and should be done. It's proper to carry out actions that will prevent the criminal acts of the state, just as it's proper to violate a traffic ordinance in order to prevent a murder. If I was standing at a street corner and the traffic light were red, let's say I was standing in my car and I drove across the traffic light to prevent somebody from, let's say, machine gunning a group of people, of course that's not violation of law. It's an appropriate and proper action. No sane judge would convict you for such an action. Similarly, a good deal of what the state authorities define as civil disobedience is not really civil disobedience. In fact, it's legal, in fact, obligatory behavior in violation of the commands of the state, which may or may not be legal commands. So one has to be rather careful about calling things illegal, I think.
Oui, mais alors là, je voudrais vous poser une question. Quand aux États-Unis, lorsque vous faites une action franchement illégale,
which I regard as illegal, not just the state.
No, when the state's an
But the
action
state
that
regards
the
as illegal.
state considers as illegal.
Yeah.
Est-ce que vous faites cette action parce que vous la trouvez
I understand.
juste
Yeah.
en vertu d'une justice idéale, ou bien est-ce que vous la faites parce que
Yeah.
la guerre de classe
Yes.
la rend utile et nécessaire?
Well,
Est-ce que vous vous référez à une justice idéale? Voilà
again,
le problème.
very often when I do something which the state regards as illegal, I regard it as legal.
Yes, that's
Because
it.
I regard the state as criminal.
Alors-
But in some instances, that's not true. That is, let me be quite concrete about it and move from the area of class war to imperialist war, where the situation is somewhat clearer and easier. Take international law, a very weak instrument as we know, but nevertheless it incorporates some rather interesting principles. Well, international law in many respects is the instrument of the powerful. That is, international law permits much too wide a range of international forceful intervention in support of existing power structures that define themselves as states and against the interests of masses of people who happen to be organized in opposition to states. But, in fact, international law is not solely of that kind. And, in fact, there are interesting elements of international law, let's say embedded in the United Nations Charter, which permit, in fact, I believe, require the citizen to act against his own state in ways that the state will falsely regard as criminal. But nevertheless, he's acting legally, because international law also happens to prohibit the threat or use of force in international affairs, except under some very narrow circumstances, of which, for example, the war in Vietnam is not one, which means that in the particular case of, let's say, the Vietnam War, the one that interests me most, the American state is acting in a criminal capacity, and people have the right to stop criminals from murdering people. Just because the criminal happens to call your action illegal when you try to stop him, that doesn't mean it is illegal. I mean, a perfectly clear case of that is the present case of the Pentagon Papers in the United States, which I suppose you know about. Reduced to its essentials and forgetting legalisms, what is happening is that the state is trying to prosecute people for exposing its crimes. That's what it amounts to.
C'est donc au nom d'une justice plus pure que vous critiquez le fonctionnement de la justice. Parce que c'est pour moi, si vous voulez, important de savoir ça, parce que nous avons actuellement en France un débat sur le problème de la justice et à propos de l'institution d'un tribunal populaire à propos de la justice. Vous connaissez le problème des... Et un certain nombre de gens, comme Sartre par exemple, pensent que pour faire actuellement la critique du système pénal en France, ou pour faire la critique des pratiques policières, de la manière dont la police se conduit, il faut faire une sorte de tribunal qui, au nom d'une justice idéale, d'une justice supérieure, d'une justice humaine en général, condamnera la pratique des juges français ou des policiers français. Et puis, il y a un autre groupe de gens, et je me sens, je travaille avec ces gens-là, qui disent non, il ne faut pas faire cela parce que quand vous vous référez à la justice idéale que le tribunal serait censé appliquer, vous vous référez en fait à un certain nombre d'idées de justice qui ont été formées à notre époque par un certain groupe d'individus qui sont eux-mêmes, malgré tout, d'une façon directe ou indirecte, les produits de la société dans laquelle nous nous trouvons. Il faut attaquer les pratiques de la justice, il faut attaquer la police, il faut attaquer les pratiques policières, mais en termes de guerre et non pas en termes de justice.
But you see, surely you believe that your role in the war is a just role, that you're fighting a just war, to bring in a concept from another domain. And that, I think, is important. If you thought that you were fighting an unjust war, you couldn't follow that line of reasoning. And I would like to slightly reformulate what you said. It doesn't seem to me that the difference is between legality and ideal justice. It's rather between legality and better justice. Now, this better system may have its defects, certainly will. But comparing the better system with the existing system and not being confused into thinking that our better system is the ideal system, we can then argue, I think, as follows, that the concept of legality and the concept of justice are not identical. They're not entirely distinct either. Insofar as legality incorporates justice in this notion, in this sense of better justice, referring to a better society, then we should follow and obey the law, and force the state to obey the law, and force the great corporations to obey the law, and force the police to obey the law, if we have the power to do so. Of course. If in those areas where the legal system happens to represent not better justice, but rather the techniques of oppression that have been codified in a particular autocratic system, well, then a reasonable human being should disregard and oppose them, at least in principle. He may not, for some reason, do it in fact.
Alors, je voulais simplement répondre à votre toute première phrase quand vous avez dit mais la guerre que vous faites contre la police, si vous ne considériez pas qu'elle est juste, vous ne la feriez pas. Alors, je vous répondrai un peu en termes de Spinoza. Je vous dirai, le prolétariat ne fait pas la guerre à la classe dirigeante parce qu'il considère que cette guerre est juste. Le prolétariat fait la guerre à la classe dirigeante parce qu'il veut, pour la première fois dans l'histoire, prendre le pouvoir. Et c'est parce qu'il veut prendre le pouvoir qu'il considère que sa guerre est juste.
Yeah, I don't agree
On fait la guerre pour gagner et pas parce qu'elle est juste.
I don't personally agree with that. For example, if I could convince myself that attainment of power by the proletariat would lead to a terroristic police state in which freedom and dignity and decent human relations would be destroyed, then I wouldn't want the proletariat to take power. In fact, the only reason for wanting any such thing, I believe, is because one thinks, rightly or wrongly, that some fundamental human values will be achieved by that transfer of power.
Alors, je vous répondrai ceci. Quand le prolétariat prendra le pouvoir, il se peut bien que le prolétariat exerce à l'égard des classes dont il vient de triompher, il exerce un pouvoir violent, dictatorial et même sanglant. Je ne vois pas quelle objection on peut faire à cela. Maintenant, vous me direz, et si le prolétariat exerce ce pouvoir sanglant, tyrannique et injuste à l'égard de lui-même, le prolétariat? Alors je vous répondrai, ça ne peut se produire que si le prolétariat n'a pas réellement pris le pouvoir, mais c'est qu'une classe extérieure au prolétariat, ou un groupe de gens intérieurs au prolétariat, une bureaucratie ou les restes de la petite bourgeoisie, etc., s'est emparé du pouvoir.
Well, I'm not at all satisfied with that theory of revolution for a lot of reasons, historical and other. But even if one were to accept it for the sake of argument, still that theory is maintaining that it is proper for the proletariat to take power and exercise it in a violent and bloody and unjust fashion because it is claimed, in my opinion falsely, that will lead to a more just society in which the state will wither away, in which the proletariat will be a universal class, and so on and so forth. If it weren't for that further justification, the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat, violent and bloody, would certainly be unjust. At least I, for example, am not a committed pacifist. That is, I don't I would not hold that it is under all imaginable circumstances wrong to use violence, even though use of violence is in some sense unjust. I believe that one has to estimate relative injustices. But the use of violence and the creation of some degree of injustice can only itself be justified on the basis of the claim and the assessment, which always ought to be undertaken very, very seriously and with a good deal of skepticism, that this violence is being exercised because a more just result is going to be achieved. If it does not have that grounding, it really is totally immoral, in my opinion.
Je ne pense pas que l'idéal de la guerre de classe, enfin le but que se propose le prolétariat en menant une guerre de classe, je ne crois pas qu'on puisse dire, enfin qu'il soit suffisant de dire que c'est une plus grande justice. Ce que le prolétariat veut faire en chassant la classe actuellement au pouvoir et en prenant pour lui le pouvoir, c'est la suppression, précisément, d'un pouvoir de classe en général.
Okay.
Car le prolétariat...
That's the further justification.
Hein?
That is the further justification.
Ça c'est la justification, mais pas en termes de justice, en termes de pouvoir.
But it is in terms of justice. It's because the end that will be achieved, it is claimed, is a just end. If no Leninist or whatever you like would dare to say we have a right to take power, let's say we, the proletariat, and then throw everyone else into crematoria, let's say. I mean, if that were the consequence of the proletariat taking power, of course it would not be appropriate. The idea is, and as for reasons I mentioned, I'm skeptical about it, that a period of violent dictatorship, of perhaps violent and bloody dictatorship, is justified because that will mean the submergence and termination of class oppression, a proper end to achieve in human life.
Mais il me semble que de toute façon, la notion même de justice fonctionne à l'intérieur de la société de classe comme revendication du côté de la classe opprimée et comme justification du côté de la classe oppressée.
I don't agree with that.
Et dans une société sans classe, je ne suis pas sûr qu'on ait encore à utiliser cette notion de justice.
Yeah. Well, here I really disagree. I think that there is a sort of an absolute basis. If you press me too hard, I'll be in trouble because I can't sketch it out. But some sort of an absolute basis ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. And I think that our existing systems of justice I think it's too hasty to characterize our existing systems of justice as merely systems of class oppression. I don't think that they are that. I think that they embody systems of class oppression, and they embody elements of other kinds of oppression. But they also embody a kind of a groping towards the true humanly valuable concept of justice and decency and love and kindness and sympathy and so on, which I think are real.
Bon, est-ce que j'ai du temps pour répondre?
Oui,
Combien? Parce que
2 minutes.
Ben, moi, je dirais que c'est injuste.
Absolutely unjust.
Non, mais bon, je ne veux pas répondre en si peu de temps. Je dirais simplement ceci. Je ne peux pas m'empêcher, contrairement à ce que vous pensez, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de croire que cette notion de nature humaine, cette notion de bonté, de justice, d'essence humaine, de réalisation de l'essence humaine, tout ça, ce sont des notions et des concepts qui ont été formés à l'intérieur de notre civilisation, dans notre type de savoir, dans notre forme de philosophie, et que par conséquent, ça fait partie même de notre système de classe, et qu'on ne peut pas, aussi regrettable que ce soit, on ne peut pas faire valoir ces notions pour décrire ou justifier un combat qui doit en principe bouleverser les fondements mêmes de notre société. Il y a là une extrapolation dont je n'arrive pas à trouver la justification historique.
Well, I think we can start immediately the discussion. And
Mr. Chomsky, I would ask you one question. In your discussion, you had the vocabulary proletariat. We as proletarian. It's the irony of history that at the moment young intellectuals coming from middle class and upper class call themselves proletarians and say we must join the proletarians. But I don't see any class conscious proletarians. That's a great dilemma.
It is not true in our given society that all people are doing useful, productive work or self-satisfying work. Obviously, it's very far from true. Those people. Lots of people who are excluded from the possibility of productive labor. And I think the revolution, if you want, should be in the name of all human beings. But it will have to be conducted by certain categories of human beings, and those will be, I think, the human beings who really are involved in the productive work of society. Now, what that is will differ depending on the society. In our society, it, I think, includes intellectual workers. So I think that the student revolutionaries, if you like, have a point, a partial point. That is, it's a very important thing in a modern, advanced industrial society. It's very important how the trained intelligentsia identify themselves, if they're going to be technocrats, let's say, or servants of either the state or private power, or alternatively, whether they're going to identify themselves as part of the workforce who happen to be doing intellectual labor. If the latter, then they can and should play a decent role in a progressive social revolution. If the former, then they're part of the class of the oppressors.
I have an additional, one small additional question or more remark to you. That is that you, with your very courageous attitude towards the war in Vietnam, how can you survive in an institution like MIT, which is known here as one of the great war contractors and intellectual makers of this war?
There are two aspects to that. One is the question how MIT tolerates me, and the other question is how I tolerate MIT. Well, as to how MIT tolerates me, here again I think one shouldn't be overly schematic. It's true that MIT is a major institution of war research, but it's also true that it embodies very important libertarian values, which are, I think, quite deeply embedded in American society, fortunately for the world. They're not deeply embedded enough to save the Vietnamese, but they're deeply enough embedded to prevent far worse disasters. And here I think one has to be a bit qualified. That is, there is imperial terror and aggression, there is exploitation, there is racism, lots of things like that. But there's also a real concern coexisting with it for individual rights of a sort which, for example, are embodied in the Bill of Rights, which is by no means simply an expression of class oppression. It is also an expression of the necessity to defend the individual against state power. Now, these things coexist, you know. It's not that simple. It's not just all bad or all good. And it's because it's the particular balance in which they coexist that makes an institute that produces weapons of war be willing to tolerate, in fact, you know, in many ways even encourage, to be quite honest, a person who's involved in civil disobedience against the war. Now, as to how I tolerate MIT, that raises another question. There are people who argue, and I've never understood the logic of this, that a radical ought to dissociate himself from all oppressive institutions. That is, the logic of that argument is that Karl Marx shouldn't have studied in the British Museum, which, if anything, was the symbol of, you know, the most vicious imperialism in the world, the place where all the treasures of empire were gathered, you know, the rape of the colonies was all poured in there, and so on and so forth. But I think Karl Marx was quite right in studying in the British Museum. He was right in using the resources and, in fact, the liberal values of the civilization that he was trying to overcome against it. And I think the same applies in this case.
But aren't you afraid that your presence at MIT gives them a clean conscience?
I don't see how, really. I mean, I think my presence at MIT serves marginally to, I hope a lot, I don't know how much, to increase student activism against a lot of the things that MIT stands for example.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this has to be the end of the debate. Mr. Chomsky, Mr. Foucault, I thank you very much for your far-going discussion, both the technical, theoretical way as the political way. I thank you very much both at the part of the audience here and at home.